I've mentioned before that I had a previous channel back in 2024. That channel is no longer on YouTube, but I still have some of the videos for that. And with the recent issues coming to light in the news about starvation in Gaza and the obvious acceleration of timelines there, I thought it might be prudent to re-release one of my videos from that previous channel that did coverage on the history of the conflict between Israel and the Palestinians. So please forgive the grainy quality of what I look like in the video. I've upgraded my equipment a little bit since then, but this video does a good job of summarizing. So take a look. I need to talk to you about something. I've been wanting to address this since before the pod started, and I really can't stay silent anymore. So, like a lot of you out there, I didn't really know a lot about the situation between Israel and the Palestinians. I mean, I had heard some of the online media guys I watched talk about it. They said that the Israeli government had imposed an apartheid state on the Palestinians. They called Gaza an open-air prison. They used a lot of other shocking sounding terms, and it sounded like hyperbole, like they were blowing it out of proportion. And then if I looked at the corporate media like CNN and Fox News, they would show Palestinians firing rockets and portraying Israel as under siege, needing to defend itself. Then I would go back to the sources I trusted, and they would show the numbers on how many dead there were on each side and the types of weapons each side had. And I would be genuinely surprised. It looked grossly uneven. The Palestinians seeming overmatched. More destruction and many more dead on that side. And so after doing a little research and verification, and it didn't take a lot, I stopped believing the corporate media outlets. Surprise, right? The conflict was several thousand miles away. I had never heard of AIPAC, didn't know the history or why they were fighting. Plus, we have so many problems right here at home. Existential threat of Trump returning to office, domestic terrorism on the rise, inflation, and just crisis after crisis. Who had time to worry about a tiny country on the other side of the world? It sounds pretty callous and maybe a little naive, but the number of victims in this war didn't seem high enough to really get my attention. I think that's probably a common sentiment. There are a lot of military conflicts in the world at any given time, and many with much higher death tolls. Ukraine, just for one example. Palestine fell off my radar. Then, October 7th, and the fallout of that. Media reported the horrible attack, babies mutilated, women raped and killed, and over 1,000 innocents dead. The world was furious, and rightly so. Israel had to protect its citizens, they told us, and the bombing started. Like a lot of people who had no real skin in the game, as I'm not Jewish and I have no Israeli or Palestinian ties by either family or friendship, I paid attention kind of dispassionately at first. And watching without a bias, it became clear that something wasn't right about the response by Israel. I expected them to send troops in to root out the terrorists, right? They make blockbuster action movies about heroic soldiers in enemy territory taking out the bad guys. And that was what I thought would happen here. Even after the first bombs dropped, I expected the ground offensive to start. But the bombs kept dropping, and the civilian dead quickly started to mount. This didn't feel like a military operation. It felt like revenge. So I started paying really close attention and became first concerned, then sickened, then utterly heartbroken at the absolute horror, and I don't use that word lightly, of what was being done. And after hearing our politicians excuse the atrocities, even the president, the guy I backed in the last election, showing unwavering support for this bullshit, sending more weapons and money, I felt this nagging guilt that my country was part of this, a big part of it. So I've educated myself, documented what I can about what's happened since October, waiting for the right moment to say my piece. Because there isn't much else I can do from here in the Midwestern suburbs. I can make my outrage known, maybe make others who don't know as much about it as I do more informed. Today, I'm going to go over the conflict, a brief history so you have some context as to why these two groups are fighting in the first place, why the Israeli government is doing this, why America is supporting it, both our politicians and certain religious groups. And spoilers, it's not always the ones you might expect. To begin with, there's a lot of history here, and I am not a historian. So I'm going to skip a lot and mostly summarize what the outcomes were of specific events. As most of you know, Israel was created by the Allies after World War II, but the land that it was established on has a storied history. Until 1917, Palestine belonged to the Ottoman Empire, and after the First World War, it was claimed by Great Britain.
When Balfour wrote of his government's intent to create a Jewish homeland in Palestine, 90% of the people living there were not Jewish. Just 31 years later, most of them were gone.
כמה אתה חושב אנשים הרגת ככה?
לא ספרתי. אני לא יכול לדעת בחיי. היה לי מקלע עם 250 כדורים.
This is the story of the British promise that led to the destruction of Palestine and the creation of the State of Israel.
Palestinians were not allowed by Britain to establish a military, despite being the majority in the country. At this time, Jewish people made about 10% of the population in Palestine, having migrated there due to scripture claiming that God had given them the land. Now remember that. Despite living scattered throughout the world for generations, the Jewish people have believed that they were promised the land of Israel by their Creator. And it's clear how that belief influences their decisions to this very day. Those who believe this were called Zionists, after a hill in Jerusalem named Mount Zion. In the New Testament, Mount Zion is used metaphorically to refer to the heavenly Jerusalem, God's holy, eternal city.
Okay, so that is a lot of history, but it's important because the Zionist movement is a critical part of the story going forward, especially after it found a friend in the British government, where a lot of high-ranking officials supported Zionism, sometimes for unexpected reasons. Prime Minister Lloyd George, for example, was a Christian zealot who believed gathering the Jewish people in Palestine would bring Jesus Christ back to earth.
At first, Britain was very accommodating to the Zionist Jews, giving them their own militia, building them schools, and encouraging immigration to Palestine.
Establishment of a Jewish home in Palestine. British rule was very accommodating to the Zionist project. The Jewish community in Palestine grew with big waves of immigration. They had their own schools and factories and even their own militia, the Haganah.
By the time of the Second World War, they had gone up from 10% to 30% of the population in Palestinian territories. The native Palestinians saw what was happening and protested.
To the Palestinians, it was clear that Britain wasn't delivering them independence. It was delivering their country to other people.
This led to a labor strike in 1936. The Brits used torture, destruction of property, and executions, attempting to break the strike over the next 3 years, and nearly 10% of Palestinian men were killed. As conflicts between Zionists and Palestinians escalated, Britain realized it had to do something. So in May of 1939, it issued the White Papers.
The Commission is studying the 20-year-old Jewish settlements in British-mandated Palestine.
The 1939 White Paper created a conflict between the British and the Zionists for the first time, because it rejected partition and said the solution was for Palestine to gain independence within 10 years, with everyone living there sharing it together.
These decreed that within 10 years, Palestine would become independent, and all the residents, both Jew and Muslim, would share equal rights. It also limited Jewish land purchases and restricted immigration to Palestine by Jews. The Zionists, who were used to having favor from the British Empire, felt betrayed. The Zionists gathered their weapons to oppose the White Papers. Then World War II happened. Millions of Jews were slaughtered, and those who could fled Europe to escape the Holocaust. A large number fled to their divinely promised homeland of Israel-Palestine, but met resistance from the British who still ruled there. Violent conflicts erupted between the Zionists and the Brits. The Zionists had 10,000 soldiers with modern weapons, many of whom were World War II veterans. They were much stronger militarily than the Palestinians, so knowing the native population could not resist them effectively, they gambled that Britain was too exhausted by the war to continue fighting for Palestine. And they were right. In 1947, Britain withdrew from the country and turned the matter over to the United Nations. The UN at that time was much smaller than it is now, with about 80 less members. Still, that body saw fit to create a new country called Israel and granted it to the Zionists who already had political and military infrastructure there. So, in May of 1948, Israel was born, but it was still a majority Muslim country, and the native Muslims rejected the declaration. But they didn't stand much of a chance. Using their superior military force, the Jewish population, backed by a European alliance who still felt a tremendous debt to the Jews that had just survived the Holocaust, drove out the Palestinians to artificially create a Jewish majority in what has come to be known as the Nakba, or in the Arabic tongue, the catastrophe. In one case, and it's by far not the only instance, an Arab village called Deir Yassin had its population of 250 Palestinians stripped, lined up, photographed, and then mowed down by machine gun fire, women and children included. When news got out about the massacre, Palestinians left en masse. 250,000 left the lands by the time Israel was officially declared a country. And for the Zionists, that still wasn't enough. The newly formed Israeli Defense Force pushed into parts of Palestine that weren't given to them by the UN, seizing miles and miles of Palestinian lands, bulldozing the homes there, and depositing Jewish settlers to take them over permanently. This caused an uproar on the world stage, and in 1949, the UN decreed that the Palestinians be allowed to return to their homes. But that declaration has proven to be completely toothless, as Israel has prohibited Palestinians from moving back into their hereditary lands to this day, while encouraging Jews to settle there instead. Like I said, though, I'm not a historian. So now that we have some context, let's fast forward to the beginning of the current conflict. So why did October 7th happen? Wasn't there a ceasefire in place? Didn't Hamas cruelly and viciously attack in an act of unprovoked savagery, beheading babies? Well,
while things may have been calm and normal for Israelis until then, for Palestinians, daily life was intolerable pain. In fact, for 16 years, Gaza has been under an Israeli siege so severe that it's often called the world's largest open-air prison. The Secretary General of the United Nations has described Gaza as hell on earth. And way back in 2012, the UN warned that if Israel's policies in Gaza didn't change, this tiny strip of land that's one of the most densely populated places on earth would become unfit for human living by 2020. It's now 2023. For the 2.3 million Palestinians who live in Gaza, the 16-year siege means that Israel controls basically everything about their lives, and it has created a humanitarian catastrophe for them. The economy is devastated because Israel limits Gaza's trade with the outside world, leaving most of the population unemployed. The health sector has also been in crisis, with medicines frequently running out and patients denied Israeli permits to leave for life-saving healthcare. And electricity only lasts a few hours a day because Israel limits the amount of fuel let into Gaza. At one point, official documents showed that Israel calculated the number of calories allowed into Gaza, just enough to keep people from starving.
Many experts on the situation worldwide call what the Palestinians have been forced to live under an apartheid state. The Oxford Dictionary defines apartheid as a policy or system of segregation or discrimination on the grounds of race.
Under international law, Israel's occupation, which is now in its 56th year, is illegal, and apartheid is a crime against humanity.
So savage, yes, but unprovoked? And how savage was the attack? Well, not great, for sure. However, were the attackers really baby-killing monsters?
Hamas behead babies? Let's look at what we know so far about where this claim came from and why some media outlets and the White House have retracted the claim. On Saturday, October 7th, Hamas attacked the kibbutz of Kfar Aza. Members of the media were granted permission on October 10th, 3 days later, by the Israeli army to visit Kfar Aza and witness the aftermath of the Hamas attack. During the visit, a reporter from Israeli news outlet I-24 tweeted saying, "Soldiers told me they believe 40 babies, children, were killed." As the day progressed, the information morphed from at least 40 babies were killed to some were beheaded. On the day, the Israeli army could not confirm beheadings. The very next day, in London, commuters were subjected to this horrifying and unverified headline. On October 11th, many Western media outlets jumped on that claim, quoting the spokesman of Israel's prime minister.
So, Israeli propaganda was used to dehumanize Palestinians by not just the media, but the president himself, lying to help his long-term allies in Israel.
During a press conference, American President Joe Biden claimed he had seen photographs of beheaded babies, saying,
"I never really thought that I would see and have confirmed pictures of terrorists beheading children."
The White House ended up retracting that statement, saying no one there had any evidence or seen any evidence of those claims. We'll return to how close an ally Biden really is and always has been to the Israeli government, and why that made him the perfect president to have in the White House during this conflict. But reports like this of Palestinian savagery made what came next a lot easier for Western audiences to swallow. It framed the attacks as justified revenge on what seemed to be subhuman animals, which benefited the Israeli government greatly in its campaign of bombing largely civilian populations. One of the excuses Israel gave for their invasion of Gaza was to rescue the over 200 hostages Hamas took on October 7th, though this lie was exposed almost immediately by the bombing campaign, which showed a clear disregard for the hostages' safety. In fact, the story of 3 hostages who escaped and made their way to IDF troops only to be gunned down by the Israel soldiers, even though they were unarmed and waving a white flag. In fact, the only time any hostages were brought back to Israel was during the brief ceasefire, where they were traded for prisoners Israel had jailed. That brings me to a brief tangent. For folks out there who are pearl clutching about the prisoners Hamas has been holding, let's talk for a moment about the thousands of Palestinians imprisoned from Gaza and the West Bank. Accused, but often not convicted of a crime, it's been reported that an estimated 7,000 Palestinians are in prison in Israel, including many minors and activists. Nearly 2,900 of those detainees are held without trial in what is called administrative detention.
2,000 Palestinians held in what's called administrative detention. According to Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, administrative detention is, quote, incarceration without trial or charge, alleging that a person plans to commit a future offense. It has no time limit, and the evidence on which it is based is not disclosed. In other words, indefinite detention for no apparent reason.
And for those who do go to trial, the rate of conviction for Palestinians in Israeli court is nearly 100%. Now, this doesn't mean we shouldn't be outraged at the hostages Hamas still holds, but considering Israel is holding over 12 times as many innocent Palestinians, even if you grant the ridiculous conviction rate of their justice system, it's difficult to see Hamas as the only guilty party here, especially if one considers that the reason for taking the hostages might have been to help negotiate the release of those innocents being held by Israel. And as to there being a ceasefire, which is a common theme among Zionists in media to portray Israel's victim status on October 7th, nothing could be further from the truth. Since, as I mentioned, I'm not a big history buff, let's look at just the last year before the October attack by Hamas and see the level of aggression that the Palestinians were under from Israel. After Netanyahu's right-wing coalition took power in late 2022, violence and land theft by Jewish settlers and the IDF became the norm. In just the West Bank, between January 1st and December 12th of 23, Israeli forces had killed 464 Palestinians, including 109 children, according to the United Nations. More than twice as many as any other year since 2005, when the UN began recording fatalities, and after 2022 had been the deadliest year for Palestinians since 2006. Here's just a few examples of the violence under this non-existent ceasefire. After a raid in late 2022 on the West Bank village of Nablus by the Israelis, killed 11 Palestinians, injured another 100, and damaged hundreds of buildings, a retaliatory shooting from the Palestinians killed 2 Israeli settlers. This, however, sparked a rampage by an estimated 300 Israeli settlers in February of 23 through a West Bank village called Huwara, as well as several surrounding villages. To no one's surprise, the only police force around, the IDF, did nothing to contain the violence, witnesses saying they just stood by and watched. Afterwards, the Israeli finance minister called for the village to be wiped out. His words. Not by settlers, but by the Israeli government itself. And then in June of 23, Israel gave that same man the sole power to build 4,500 new illegal settlements on Palestinian land. The very next day, Israeli soldiers stormed the city of Jenin in the West Bank, even deploying helicopter gunships in the attack, killing 6 and wounding 91. They continued their assault on the town for weeks into July, raiding hospitals with tear gas and live ammo. In one instance, the IDF bombed a theater where civilians who were displaced by the violence were sheltering, killing 12 and injuring 5 children. They bulldozed roads to block emergency and medical services and left the more than 30,000 residents of Jenin without power or water. And these are just a few examples. The attacks on Palestinians have been virtually non-stop. Things have been this way for as long as most members of the population of Gaza can remember, since more than 50% of them are children. In fact, only 2 weeks before the October 7th attack, Israel launched 3 days of strikes on Gaza after already committing an attack on the West Bank. Their excuse for the strikes? Hamas launched what they called incendiary balloons into nearby Israeli land. Want to know what an incendiary balloon looks like? Yeah, they're the same kind of balloons you get down at Party City for your kid's birthday. Israel responded by sending their F-35 fighter jets to bomb Gaza for 3 straight days. Seems like a reasonable response, right? So, while I refuse to excuse the attack by Hamas, of course, I think you might begin to understand the level of desperation, the complete lack of hope that might drive people to ally with or join with such vicious groups. But to circle back around, yeah, no ceasefire. Total bullshit. Well, this has been a lot, but I feel like we needed to get all of this out of the way to get where we are now and have been since October. Please join me for my second part of this 2-part series on the Israel-Palestine conflict, where I'll take a dive into what the toll of the conflict has taken on both the Palestinian people and the reputation and standing in the world of Israel. I'll also talk about how the media and the U.S. government has not only been complicit, but supportive of the atrocities.